In 1953, a box of elbow macaroni cost just 9 cents. In a coal mining town in eastern Kentucky, a mother could turn that single box into 5 different family dinners before the week was over. Each one filling, each one made from whatever was left in the kitchen. We called that poverty. She called it Tuesday. Somewhere between then and now, we lost dozens of ways to feed a family with a pound of macaroni. The food industry built entire aisles of boxed shortcuts to replace what grandmothers already knew. Simple recipes. No waste, no extras, just skill, resourcefulness, and making every ingredient count. This is what they replaced. Number 25. Macaroni and tomatoes. You have to understand what a can of tomatoes meant in 1952. It wasn't a pantry staple, it was the backup plan. The thing you reached for when everything else was gone. A can cost 7 cents. Macaroni cost 9. For 16 cents, a woman in rural Tennessee could feed 5 people and have leftovers for tomorrow. She drained the macaroni, poured the tomatoes straight in, juice and all, bacon grease, salt, pepper, a pinch of sugar. The tomatoes broke down into something between a sauce and a broth, turning the whole pot the color of a late October sunset. Today we call it pasta pomodoro. We charge $18 a plate. In 1952, it was just supper. Nobody gave it a name because it didn't need one. Number 24. Macaroni and beans in the Italian immigrant neighborhoods of Cleveland and Chicago, nobody called it pasta e fagioli. That name came later when grandchildren moved to the suburbs and ordered it for $12 at places with exposed brick walls. In the tenements of the 1930s, they called it beans and macaroni, made it 3 times a week because it cost 11 cents and fed everyone. Dried navy beans, garlic, salt pork, a bay leaf. Macaroni added in the last 15 minutes, absorbing the starch, thickening everything into something not quite soup, not quite stew. Just a quiet, satisfied weight in your stomach. The grandmothers who made it never took a nutrition class. They just knew what kept people standing. Number 23. Macaroni gravy. There was no cheese, no meat. Just flour, fat, water, and macaroni. In the poorest households of Mississippi and Alabama in the late 1930s, this appeared when everything else ran out. Made with such quiet confidence that children ate it, without knowing they were eating almost nothing. Brown the flour in a dry skillet first. That step mattered. It turned raw flour into something nutty, smoky, something that suggested depth where there was very little. Then lard, then water, stirred until it thickened into a pale gravy. Poured over plain boiled macaroni, Grandma called it gravy mac. She made it without measuring, without apologizing. She set it on the table. Nobody left hungry. Number 22. Hamburger macaroni skillet in 1953. A pound of ground beef cost 31 cents. Macaroni cost 9. A can of tomatoes cost 7. For 47 cents, a factory worker's wife in Akron or Flint could feed a family of 5 and pack her husband's lunch for tomorrow. Brown the meat. Drain the fat. But not all of it, because fat was flavor and flavor was free. Add tomatoes, macaroni, water, salt, pepper. Cover it. Let everything absorb until the skillet became one unified thing. In 1971, General Mills launched Hamburger Helper and called it a convenience. This dish predates that product by 20 years. They didn't invent this meal. They packaged the memory of it and sold it back to the women who already knew. That is not progress. That is theft with a mascot. Number 21. Macaroni and milk. This one is the hardest to explain to someone who didn't grow up with it, because it sounds like an accident. It sounds like something you make when you open the refrigerator and find nothing. But in the rural South and the Ozarks of the 1930s and 40s, macaroni and milk was a deliberate thing, a specific thing, made with intention and served with love and understood to be exactly what it was. Boil the macaroni, drain it, pour it back into the pot and add warm whole milk. Not cold, never cold, because cold milk turned it pasty and wrong. A thick slice of butter, salt, sometimes a little black pepper if the children were older. The milk didn't fully absorb. It sat around the macaroni in a thin, creamy pool, warm and faintly sweet the way only whole milk from a local farm ever was. They fed this to sick children. They fed it to babies moving off soft food. They fed it to old people whose teeth had gone and who needed something warm and easy and filling. There is no modern version of this dish. No restaurant serves it. No food company ever tried to sell it in a box. It just disappeared, quietly, without ceremony, sometime around 1965 when processed cheese spread convinced everyone that real dairy was inconvenient. She was right. Everything she knew was right. Number 20. Macaroni loaf there is something almost defiant about the macaroni loaf. It is macaroni packed into a loaf pan, baked until it holds its shape, and brought to the table sliced like meatloaf, presented with the same dignity, the same deliberateness, the same unspoken message that this is a real dinner, served to real people, in a real home. In the farmhouses of Kansas and Nebraska in the 1940s, it appeared on Sunday tables when there was no meat to serve and no explanation owed to anyone. Cooked macaroni mixed with beaten eggs, shredded cheese if available, a little onion, salt, pepper, sometimes a spoonful of mustard for sharpness, pressed into a greased loaf pan and baked at 350 degrees for 40 minutes until the edges browned and the inside set firm enough to slice. Served with a ladle of tomato sauce or brown gravy poured over the top. The presentation was everything. Because presentation was the only thing that cost nothing, this was not poverty dressed up. This was a woman refusing to let poverty set the table. Number 19. Stovetop macaroni and cheese, not the box, not the orange powder, not the product that Kraft introduced in 1937 and spent the next 4 decades convincing America was what macaroni and cheese was supposed to taste like. The real one, the one that existed before Kraft, decided that a generation of mothers needed to be retrained. Butter melted in a heavy pot. Flour whisked in until it formed a pale paste. Whole milk added slowly, stirred constantly, cooked until it thickened into a bechamel that coated the back of a wooden spoon. Then real cheese, sharp cheddar, whatever block was in the house, grated in and stirred until it melted into a sauce the color of late afternoon sunlight, smooth and sharp and faintly tangy in a way that no powder in any box has ever replicated. Macaroni folded in and served immediately. Kraft sold their boxed version for 19 cents in 1937 and marketed it as feeding a family of 4 for 1/3 the cost of homemade. The math was technically correct. What they didn't advertise was what they removed. The nutrition in real cheese, the protein in real milk, the fat-soluble vitamins that powdered cheddar substitute cannot contain. A generation of children grew up thinking the box was normal. Their grandmothers knew better, and nobody listened. Number 18. Macaroni and Sardinessa can of sardines cost 10 cents in 1948. 10 cents for a tin packed with small, oily fish that Portuguese fishermen in New Bedford and Italian immigrants in Boston's North End had been eating for generations. Not because they couldn't afford anything better, but because they understood something about sardines that American food culture has spent 70 years trying to rediscover. Garlic softened in olive oil. The sardines added whole and broken apart with a fork, the oil from the tin poured in because wasting it was unthinkable. A pinch of red pepper flakes. The macaroni tossed in and stirred over heat until every piece was coated in that dark, deeply savory oil. Maybe a squeeze of lemon if there was one on the windowsill. The omega-3 fatty acids in 1 can of sardines exceed what most Americans now consume in a week. The garlic and olive oil combination that immigrant grandmothers used instinctively is now the subject of Mediterranean diet research, costing millions of dollars in grant funding. Today, sardine pasta appears on Brooklyn gastropub menus for $24 under the heading Forgotten Flavors. In 1948, in the North End of Boston, it was Wednesday night supper and it cost a dime. Number 17. Cold macaroni salad. Before the mayonnaise industry got involved, macaroni salad was dressed with vinegar. Apple cider vinegar thinned with a little water, seasoned with salt, pepper, a pinch of sugar, sometimes celery seed, tossed with cooked macaroni and whatever vegetables were available, sliced radishes, green onions, chopped celery, a hard-boiled egg or two if the hens had been cooperative, chilled overnight in the icebox, and brought to the church fellowship hall in a covered bowl large enough to feed 20 people. This fed 20 people for 35 cents. The church suppers of rural Illinois and Indiana and Ohio in the early 1950s ran on dishes like this. Light, sharp, clean, nothing that would spoil in a warm fellowship hall, nothing that required refrigeration to survive the hour drive to the church. Then came the mayonnaise campaigns. Hellmann's ran aggressive advertising through the late 1950s, specifically targeting church and community gatherings. Potluck recipes printed in women's magazines that called for 3/4 of a cup of mayonnaise in every macaroni salad. The vinegar version didn't disappear because it was worse. It disappeared because someone spent money making sure women who didn't use mayonnaise felt like they were doing it wrong. That is not progress. That is a condiment company rewriting community food memory. Number 16. Macaroni and cabbage. In the coal mining patches of western Pennsylvania and the steel mill neighborhoods of Youngstown and Pittsburgh, the Slovak and Polish grandmothers made this on Friday nights, and it smelled like the whole block. Cabbage shredded thin and cooked down slowly in butter. Real butter, a full stick, not a suggestion of it, until it softened and sweetened and turned the faintest shade of gold at the edges. Macaroni tossed in. Salt, black pepper, sometimes a pinch of caraway seed. That was the entire recipe. The cabbage did something during that long, slow cook that no amount of hurrying could replicate. The natural sugars in it caramelized gradually, turning sharp raw brassica into something almost sweet, something nutty and soft that clung to the macaroni in a way that no sauce could. There was no sauce. The butter and the cabbage and the pasta were the sauce. A full pan, enough to feed 6 people, cost 18 cents in 1949. Today restaurants in Pittsburgh call it haluski and charge $14 for a portion that a grandmother would have called a side dish. They knew things about the chemistry of slow cooking that we will spend the next 50 years trying to remember. They just called it Friday supper. In 1959, the United States Department of Agriculture quietly revised its guidance for school lunch programs and home economics curricula. Macaroni-based dishes were recategorized as incomplete meals, not because the science said so, but because the meat and dairy lobbying organizations had spent over $2 million between 1955 and 1962 pressuring the USDA to reframe what counted as a proper American dinner. The macaroni and beans that Italian immigrant grandmothers had been feeding their families since the 1920s was a nutritionally complete meal, complete protein, complex carbohydrates, iron, folate, sustained caloric energy. The science on legume and grain protein complementarity was documented as early as 1914. The USDA knew this. The lobbyists knew this too. They reclassified it anyway. They inserted a meat requirement into the school lunch program. They trained a generation of home economics teachers to tell young women that a meal without animal protein was not a real meal. The grandmothers who knew better were by then being called old-fashioned. This is not ancient history. The generation that grew up eating these macaroni dinners is still alive. Their grandchildren are buying protein powder and meal subscriptions and wondering why they're always hungry. The knowledge is not gone. It was deliberately buried. That is not progress. That is commerce dressed up as nutrition science. Number 15. Macaroni and fried onions and onion costs almost nothing. In 1945, in rural Georgia or eastern Tennessee, A whole mesh bag of yellow onions cost 5 cents at the farm stand at the end of the road. And a woman who knew what she was doing with a cast iron skillet and a little patience could turn those onions into something that made a bowl of plain macaroni taste like it had been cooking all day. Low heat, enough lard or butter to coat the pan. Onions sliced thin and left alone, not stirred every 30 seconds the way impatient cooks do it now, but left alone to sit against the hot iron and slowly surrender their moisture, their sharpness, their raw bite, until they collapsed into dark amber ribbons that smelled like sweetness and char at the same time. Tossed over a bowl of macaroni while still hot. Salt, that was the whole recipe. The Maillard reaction, the same chemical process that makes a seared steak taste like a seared steak, happening in a 5-cent onion over a 30-year-old skillet. Free. Available to anyone. No one told them it was chemistry. They just knew it worked. Number 14. Macaroni soup knot minestrone. Not the $12 bowl at the Italian restaurant with the crusty bread on the side. Just soup. Thin broth made from a ham bone or a chicken carcass, or sometimes just water with a little salt and pepper and whatever vegetable had survived to the end of the week. A handful of macaroni added in the last 10 minutes, swelling in the broth, soaking up the flavor of whatever the liquid had given up. In immigrant Italian households across America from the 1930s through the 1950s, this was the meal that stretched. You could add to it every day. Left over from Monday, a little more water and another handful of macaroni on Tuesday, a carrot or a wilted celery stalk on Wednesday. The pot never fully emptied. It evolved. There was a nutritional logic to the bone broth base that nobody had named yet. Collagen, minerals, gelatin that soothed digestion and supported joints. We now sell bone broth in cartons at $7 each and call it functional food. In 1938 in South Philadelphia, it was just what you did with the bones so they didn't go to waste. Grandma just called it not throwing good food away. Number 13. Macaroni and peas 5 ingredients. 15 minutes. Eaten by working families in New Orleans and southern Louisiana, Creole households. Italian immigrant families, the communities where those two cultures had spent a century mixing into something entirely their own since at least the 1930s. Olive oil in a pan. A clove of garlic pressed flat with the side of a knife and laid in the oil until it turned gold and the whole kitchen smelled like Sunday. Canned peas added with their liquid. Macaroni folded in, salt, black pepper, a little of the pasta water to loosen it. The peas dissolved slightly at the edges, thickening the oil into a pale green sauce that barely deserved the name sauce. It was more like a suggestion, a coating, something that tied the macaroni to the peas and the garlic oil and made it taste like it had been planned, like it was intentional, like it was a meal, and not just ingredients that happened to be in the same pot. It still exists in Naples. In the neighborhoods of New Orleans, where Italian and Creole foods still meet, older women still make it. In the rest of America, it disappeared sometime around 1965, replaced by the casserole, replaced by the cream soup, replaced by something that required a can opener and a trip to the store. The original needed a pot and 5 cents worth of canned peas, number 12. Macaroni and chipped beef, the soldiers called it SOS. The name was not flattering, but the soldiers ate it anyway. Ate it at breakfast in mess halls from Fort Bragg to Camp Pendleton because it was hot and filling and arrived fast and stuck to your ribs for the 6 hours until the next meal. When those soldiers came home in 1945 and 1946 and married women who needed to stretch a food budget, they brought the recipe with them. A jar of dried beef cost 19 cents in 1952. Torn into pieces and simmered in a white gravy made from butter and flour and milk poured over a bowl of macaroni. It was salty, dramatically, almost aggressively salty, the way food cooked for working men always was, because working men lost salt in sweat and needed it back. Salt and fat and starch and protein, all in one bowl, on the table in 15 minutes. The dried beef that fed a family of 4 for under 30 cents in 1952 is now sold under names like artisan cured beef and Bresaola-style sliced beef at specialty grocery stores for $14 a package. The rebranding required 0 changes to the product. Just a different customer, a different shelf, and 50 years of collective forgetting. Number 12. Streak-O lean and milk gravy, a single strip of salt pork, striped with fat and lean, which is exactly where the name comes from. Fried in Tennessee and Kentucky kitchens until crisp, then pulled from the pan so the drippings could be turned into gravy with flour and milk. That gravy, poured thick over biscuits, stretched one strip of meat costing about 8 cents a pound into a meal that fed 6 people. That is not progress. What replaced this? That is the loss of knowing how to make almost nothing go, almost all the way around a table. The company store kept the books, and the books never came out in the sharecropper's favor. Furnishing merchants across the Cotton South advanced food, seed, and supplies against the next harvest, then charged interest rates between 25 and 65% on those advances. A family could work from sunup to sundown for an entire growing season and still owe money at settlement time, every single year by design. In 1930, while these families were grinding their own corn and rendering their own lard from animals they raised themselves, a company called Chelsea Milling started selling a box of pre-mixed corn muffin batter under the name Jiffy. It promised to save women time on a task that, for these families, was never the burden the advertisement assumed it was. It was the one part of the system that actually belonged to them. The company store could charge 65% interest on flour. It could not yet charge for the knowledge of how to turn a bag of cornmeal into a meal for 6. That came later, number 11. Red-eye gravy and biscuits. Eastern Tennessee and Appalachian kitchens turned ham drippings and a splash of black coffee into a thin, dark gravy that cut the salt of country ham and pooled around a split biscuit. The secret ingredient was never a secret. It was whatever was already sitting in the pot from breakfast, repurposed instead of thrown out. There was no recipe card for this. There was only a woman who knew that nothing in her kitchen got wasted twice. Number 10. Hog jowl and black-eyed peas across the Carolinas and Georgia. Jowl meat, the cheek of the hog, cheap at about 4 cents a pound, simmered low with black-eyed peas until both went tender and the broth thickened into something dark and savory. Families served it for New Year's for luck. They served it every other week the rest of the year because it was cheap, filling, and good. Today it shows up as black-eyed pea hummus, $9 a plate at a wine bar that has never heard the words hog jowl spoken out loud. Number 9. Chitlins. Chitterlings. If you're being formal about it, the small intestines of the hog, cleaned for hours, and it took hours, real labor, real patience, then simmered until tender and finished crisp in a hot pan. Mississippi, Delta, and Louisiana families made this at hog-killing time because the alternative was throwing away a part of the animal that still had nourishment in it. This was not poverty desperation. This was an entire cuisine built on a single principle. Nothing about that hog goes in the ground. Not the head, not the feet, not the parts polite society pretended didn't exist. The women who cooked this fed their families on what wealthier kitchens called garbage, and they did it with skill that took years to earn. Number 8. Squirrel and dumplings. In the hardwood forests of the Ozarks and Appalachia, squirrel was free protein for anyone who could shoot straight or set a snare. Browned, then simmered low with broth and cornmeal dumplings dropped on top to steam, it stretched a small animal into a stew that filled 6 bowls. This dish only exists where the hardwoods grow thick enough to hunt. Nowhere else. That is geography deciding what's for supper. Number 7. Rabbit stew with cornmeal dumplings. Winter on Texas and Arkansas tenant farms meant trapped meat more often than bought meat. A rabbit, browned and simmered with whatever root vegetables the cellar still had, topped with dumplings made from cornmeal and water. This stew on the table meant someone in the family still had a steady hand with a snare line, and that the family would eat regardless of what cash was or wasn't in the house. That stew was not luck. It was a skill kept alive because there was no backup plan if it failed. By the late 1930s, federal subsidies under the Agricultural Adjustment Act paid landlords to take cotton acreage out of production. Those payments were supposed to help the families working that land. Instead, landlords pocketed the subsidy and evicted the sharecroppers who'd farmed it, since fewer acres meant fewer workers were needed at all. Mechanization finished the job over the next 2 decades. Families scattered north by the millions, carrying almost nothing with them, and what got left behind, more often than not, was the knowledge in the kitchen. Nobody wrote it down. There wasn't time, and there wasn't paper to spare. They knew things about feeding 6 people on almost nothing that we will spend the next 50 years trying to remember, and the system that displaced them never once asked what would be lost in the leaving. Number 6. Fried river catfish. Mississippi and Alabama families living near the water caught their protein instead of buying it. Catfish pulled from the river, dredged in cornmeal, fried hot and fast in a skillet on the porch. The smell of cornmeal and hot grease drifted through shotgun houses on summer evenings, calling everyone in from the yard before the sun went down. Caught, not bought. An entire category of meals that the company store never touched, because the river didn't send a bill. Number 5. Cushaw squash, baked slow in sorghum syrup. This pale, crookneck squash, kept for months in a root cellar without refrigeration. The vegetable built to survive a southern winter when there was no ice to be had. Sliced and baked with the family's own cane syrup poured over the top, it caramelized into something between a vegetable and a dessert. Appalachian and rural Georgia families leaned on it from October straight through to spring. A squash that didn't need an ice box to survive the winter is not a small thing. That is a food system designed for a kitchen with nothing in it but a pot and a fire. Number 4. Sweet potato pone. Grated sweet potato, mixed with a little flour, sugar, and whatever spice was on hand, baked slow until it set into something dense and sweet, somewhere between a pudding and a cake. South Carolina and Georgia gardens grew sweet potatoes at about 2 cents a pound, and a single pone could feed the whole table for dessert 2 nights running. Today it's sweet potato budino, $12 at a farm-to-table restaurant that's never planted a sweet potato in its life. Number 3. Hot water cornbread. No eggs, no milk, no buttermilk, even on the nights there wasn't any to spare. Just cornmeal, boiling water, and a pinch of salt, stirred into a stiff paste and dropped by the spoonful into bacon grease screaming in a black skillet. It hissed when it hit. It came out with a crust like a riverbed, cracked and golden, and a center that was almost custard. This was the floor. The absolute bottom of what a southern kitchen could produce and still call it a meal. Cotton Belt families across Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia made it on nights when nothing else was in the house. Cornmeal ran about 3 cents a pound in 1933, and a pound could feed a family of 5 for 2 days if it had to. Grandma just called it cornbread. She didn't call it deprivation. She called it Tuesday. Number 2. Buttermilk pie. Buttermilk, eggs, sugar, and a little flour baked into a custard pie with a top that browned almost like caramel. Statewide across the rural South, this was the dessert that needed nothing from the company store but flour and sugar, because the buttermilk came from the family's own cow. Today it's buttermilk chess pie. $9 a slice at a trendy bakery with a chalkboard menu and zero mention of where the recipe was born. That is not progress. That is theft with better lighting. Number one, cane syrup cake. This was the closing dish, the one saved for fall, after the sorghum cane had been cut, pressed, and boiled down by the family's own hands into syrup dark as molasses. That syrup, folded into a simple cake batter with butter and eggs, baked into something dense, rich, and faintly smoky. A cake owing absolutely nothing to the company store. Grown on their land, pressed with their labor, boiled over their own fire, Eastern Texas and Louisiana families made this cake as close to celebration as the calendar allowed. It was the one dish in this entire countdown that the system had no hand in at all. Closing squirrel and dumplings. Chitlins, cleaned for hours by hands that had every right to be tired of cleaning anything else by then. A cane syrup cake made from a crop the family grew, pressed, and boiled themselves. Three different refusals to waste a single thing this country handed them, which, in 1930's sharecropper country, was almost nothing. The women who ran these kitchens have mostly been written out of the story, except as a backdrop for somebody else's poverty photograph. They were not desperate. They were exact. They knew which weed would kill you and which one would feed you. They knew how to make one strip of pork stretch across 6 plates. They knew chemistry without ever calling it that, and biology without a single textbook in the house. She was right. Everything she knew was right. The company store charged 65% interest on flour these families could have ground themselves. The federal government sat on the cure for a disease that was killing thousands of them, because admitting the cause meant admitting the poverty. And when the land finally let these families go, the only thing the system never managed to repossess was what was in their hands. That is the part they couldn't take. That is the part we're trying to get back Trey one this week. Just one. Pick whichever item called your grandmother's kitchen. Back to you the loudest comment below, and tell me which one your grandmother made.